Welcome to this Interrobang session here at the Wheeler Centre. I'm Michael Williams, I'm Director of the Wheeler Centre. Before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge we're on the lands of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, the elders past and present, and elders and members of other communities who may be with us today. We're talking about the future. It's time. Interrobang has been going all day long. Show of hands, how many of you have been at other sessions so far? Excellent, that's a pretty good hit rate. Yes, the people on the stage also. The concept behind Interrobang was simultaneously complicated and quite simple. It was the idea that a better society is based around asking better questions, that we're all too certain of too many things, and we need to ask more things of ourselves and one another. And that's the process. So the program was put together by crowdsourcing it. We put it out into the world and said, we want to hear the questions you're most seeking answers to. And a number of those questions were plucked out to become sessions in their own right, and one of them was, what future do we want and deserve? Which is one of those things. So many of the questions that we got were about the future, about the kind of place we're going to be, what we're going to become, who we want to be. And so we've assembled this panel of people all with that starry look in their eye of gazing into the future, and we're going to take that as our starting point and we're going to see where it takes us. I'm going to introduce them one by one. To my extreme left is Cory Doctorow. He's co-editor of Boing Boing and the former European director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He's a science fiction author, activist, journalist and blogger, and author of the YA graphic novel In Real Life, the non-fiction business book Information Doesn't Want to Be Free, as well as countless other young adult novels and novels for adults. Please make him very welcome. Immediately next to him is Maggie Ryan Sandford. Maggie's a science journalist, fiction and comedy writer. Good combination, I think, comedy and science. She's also a human behaviour researcher at the Science Museum of Minnesota. Her work focuses on equity in science education, the relationship between science and art, and cetaceans. Cetaceans?
Cetaceans,
yes.
Whales and dolphins, for those of you
whales and dolphins.
Obsessed.
And apparently the future will be all whales and dolphins, so that is quite handy. With a background in broadcast radio and TV production, sketch comedy, English literature and biology, her work has appeared in many publications. Make her very welcome.
Thank you.
Technically speaking, Kristin Alford is the only person qualified to sit on this stage and talk about the future. She's a futurist and also founding director of foresight agency Bridge 8. She has a PhD in process engineering and a Masters of Management in Strategic Foresight.
That's a real thing, just to...
She's also the best person here at making up pretend jobs and things that she does. That means that she advises all kinds of people, from not-for-profits to government to educational organisations, about the question of the big questions about social, environmental, technological change. Please make her very welcome.
Thank you.
And last but not least, immediately next to me is Adam Liaw. Adam is a unique voice in Australian food. He's a food columnist for Fairfax and The Guardian and the author of 4 hugely popular cookbooks on Asian cuisines. You might know him from his SBS TV show Destination Flavour, which is now in its 4th series. You may know him from MasterChef. If you're a MasterChef person, you may know him as a regular guest on a Radio National show called Blueprint for Living. It's hosted by a magnificent bearded arts administrator whose name I forget temporarily. Please welcome Adam Liaw. So it's a funny one, that question, what future do we want and deserve? There's a lot packed into it. In particular, I like the anxiety implied in deserve. The questioner on the internet clearly believes that they maybe shouldn't be getting the future that they're going to have. So I just want to start by asking each of you for your earliest memory of an awareness of the future. When you thought about the future as a kid, how did you picture it? Adam?
I mean, it's trite to say, but I'd have to say the Jetsons, probably. You know, it was. And I'm not actually joking when I say that. It was this very clear vision of family life forward, whatever, 200 years or whatever it was, 7 years or whatever it could have been at that point. But it was technologically based, but the people and the characters and the motivations were all the same. You know, the lives were easier through technology. Technology facilitated things, but it didn't change the people that we were. And I don't think people anticipate themselves changing whenever they think about the future. They always think that surroundings change, but people stay the same. And that's kind of what the Jetsons showed, I think. And
so did you relate to what you saw in the Jetsons? I mean, did you personally... Was that something that excited you and motivated you, the idea of those changes?
It excited me more than, say, Back to the Future 2 version of the future, because the Jetsons actually didn't place a lot of the emphasis on the video calls and the teleporting and the driverless cars and all those things. It was just kind of accessories to their lifestyle, whereas Back to the Future was very much forcing those futuristic developments in your face. And so I think the Jetsons, for me, was more kind of honest in the way that they portrayed it.
I like the fact that the name George was going to prevail into the future. I thought that was heartening. Kristin?
I'm reminded of, I think I must have been grade 4, so around about 8, and we had to do a science project, and my dad helped me build a solar water heater. You know that sort where you put aluminium foil down, then you coil a hose, and then you put black plastic down and you heat up the water through the... I'm not getting any nods. No one's ever made a solar hot water system. And we did it in the front yard. And my father's a professor, so he also took me out to the university and he showed me where the solar research place was and sort of said, this, what you've made here is what they're doing in there. And,
just a regular childhood.
And I just assumed that we'd all be running off solar all the time, and that was my version of the future, that there was this new type of very efficient, affordable, easy to access type of energy, and that our lives would be improved by this technology.
That's crazy talk.
You must have been pretty embarrassed when you found out that the future was coal.
I know, good for humanity.
Silly,
Who knew?
Clean though, don't worry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. That's where we're going. It's a coal-powered future. Maggie?
I was just relating to how idealistic that sounded, because my first notion of the future, to totally pigeonhole myself, was that by now we would be talking to the animals, you know, and along with that would be, obviously we can't speak the same language as they do, but we would have figured out how to telepathically communicate, which may not be words, but something sort of deeper and universal, and especially with whales. So here's hoping.
My dad was a computer scientist who went back to teachers college to become a maths and computer science teacher. And the most futuristic thing I remember from that period in the mid-70s was he came home having watched an extraordinary film that you can watch on YouTube today. It's called The Mother of All Demos. And a computer researcher named Doug Engelbart in 1968, who worked at Xerox PARC Palo Alto Research Center, convened a group of eminent technologists, computer scientists, and business people and academics, and demonstrated proof of concept devices that he was working on. Light pens, mice, video conferencing, and internetworking, and graphic user interfaces. And up until then, I'd been using computers at home that were just teletypes. They didn't have screens. And so my dad came home and described this to me, and that to me felt like not just futuristic, but inevitable, right? That's where we were headed. But the thing that Engelbart's vision didn't have, and the thing that I didn't get, and the thing that surprised me, and maybe the lesson that I've taken with me since then, is the notion that all complex ecosystems have parasites. The Doug Engelbart future was the Epcot Center future. It was the Jetsons future. It was very clean, right? It didn't have 419 Nigerian scammers, and it didn't have griefers who take over your webcam, exploiting a zero-day, capture incidental nude footage, and then threaten to expose it on your MySpace account unless you perform live sex acts on your webcam for them, right? Like, all of that stuff that turned out to have been actually in the future was missing from the Doug Engelbart. The people were missing around the edges. And that I think was kind of the collision of the future I anticipated and the future we got.
It's interesting to me the crucial role that technology plays in our conception of the future at all times. Like, when we talk about futuristic things, there's no question that at some point it comes down to those mechanisms of how we live our life, how we run our society. What do you think, and this comes back to the idea of the future we deserve, what do you think the innate human qualities that we need to keep in mind are when we think about the future?
Yeah, I was going to say, my best example of this is an exercise we run, and we run it with everyone from year 8 to older people at university of the third age. And we start off by asking them, what will life be like in 2040? Which is fantastic when you do that with 70-year-olds. And then we share an invention which is called utility fog. I'm not going to explain that, but basically we ask people to go, have you had this thing called utility fog, which is basically lots of robots that would do stuff for you? What would the world be like? You know, what would you be doing? And I distinctly remember one year 8 boy who, when asked to imagine his life, he said, I'm going to be driving a red Corvette and I'm going to be married to Stephanie. I don't know if he told Stephanie this. I'm not even sure if she was in the room. But to me, that resonates, because that's what we hear time and time again. It's actually not the technology. I mean, maybe the red Corvette. But it was very much around, you know, I will have a relationship, I will have children, I will have a home. It's a very domestic future, actually, what people want when they start to imagine that. And even when you pull it apart and you help expand the thinking around what people actually want, it still comes back to that connection of people and being part of a family group in some way. It's quite strong.
Cory, your last answer implied, well, didn't just imply, presented the human as the parasite in the machine. To a certain extent. What are the innate human qualities that are going to shape the way technology develops?
So one of the truisms about technology early adoption that I think is wrong in an interesting way is the idea that pornographers are eager technology adopters. And this is a thing that comes up whenever we talk about technology. So people who are who make porn were the first ones to jump on VCRs, and then the first one to jump on the internet, and so on. And I once said this very blithely in front of a very smart person, a guy named John Gilmore, who's one of the founders of EFF, and who founded the first dial-up ISP, the Little Garden. And John said the reason pornographers are early adopters to the internet is the same reason kids are, and is the same reason terrorists are, which is that figuring out how to use something that's new and not very polished requires some energy. And if your situation in society is such that you can communicate without a lot of expenditure of energy, there's no reason to expend fresh energy to get over the kind of hump of figuring out how to use this crappy new internet thing. The only people for whom it's worthwhile to expend all the energy necessary to kind of get over the hump, to get your inertia going, to master a new technological medium, are people who are doing something that isn't permitted in the mainstream. So kids aren't permitted to socialize with one another freely in the mainstream. Pornography obviously is very fraught. Terrorists have very fraught communications and so on. And so those people are early adopters, but not because they're intrinsically enthusiastic about technology. And so one of the questions I think is useful to ask when we consider new modes of collective action and new modes of communication emerging from computers is that the most vigorous early adopters will be whoever it is have been systematically deprived of it in the real world. Like, there's an amazing thing you can do with a phone, which is that you can buy phones that have 2 SIM cages. And then if you shop around, you can find the carrier that has free texting and the other carrier that has free calls to your best friends. And you can buy each of their SIMs. And you can text your friends from one and you can call them from the other. And I don't know a single wealthy, educated person who does this. But all of the women who worked in the daycare that my daughter attended in East London did this because they are poor. And for them, figuring out how to shave 30–50% off their mobile phone bill every month is an excellent investment. And so they became hardcore early adopters of this technology that has so far escaped almost every middle-class person in the world.
It's also about the human connection too, right? The necessity to overcome the thing in order to connect with your people. And also the same is probably true about pornography.
Well, but the point is that if you're wealthy, the total your texting bill, even if you're a crazy texter, your texting bill is a tiny piece of your discretionary income. And if you're poor, then your texting bill is a massive piece of your discretionary income. And so the net benefit to you of investing several hours into working out how to use the weird Android variants that let you switch among your multiple SIMs pays for itself in a week. Whereas if you are wealthy, the money that you could make or save in that same amount of time doing something less tedious, it totally swamps the savings that you get from figuring out how to configure your phone so that you are texting and calling on the correct SIMs.
It's like...
I was going to say, it reminds me of the other thing that we see is we kind of assume the future is going to be uniform. The Jetsons' future is a very uniform future, and it's just not. It's
I
just
sense
not.
a William Gibson quote coming on.
No, I was going to
go,
no,
do it.
No.
The future is here. You can finish. The future is here.
It's just not evenly distributed. I can't believe you made me do that.
Yeah, no, it was just a drinking game. This whole session, you can all go home now. That was the point of the exercise, and we got this surprisingly quickly.
It's good to get it over with. We can move on now.
It's essential. That idea of necessity as an engine for the future and the engine for things developing is a really interesting one. Do you think that's why we're not talking to animals, Maggie? That we haven't yet found the reason why we should bother?
Yes.
That sounded callous. I'm sure they're very interesting.
I think so. In my imaginary future where we were talking to animals, ultimately the mechanism for that was that we had found a way to communicate through empathy and through something other than capitalism and separate from the things that actually make the world go round. And this was what was so idealistic about my idea, that suddenly in the future, not suddenly, in the future we would have overcome the things that are holding us back as a human race now, and that would have afforded things like communicating in ways that previously had been unavailable because we hadn't tapped into that part of our psychic ability or whatever it was. So I think it's more of a moral issue than a necessity type thing.
I don't think necessity plays a very big role in it at all. Some of our biggest, particularly technological advances, have nothing to do with necessity whatsoever. Space exploration does not affect the way that we live our day-to-day lives now. Space exploration back in the 60s has brought a lot of technologies that we now use today, but we actually, as people that live in modern societies and even people that live in non-modern societies, don't use a lot of cutting-edge technology. We don't. If you look at, for example, stock exchanges and the computing power that goes into those guys that buy properties a kilometre away from the New York Stock Exchange so that they can get their trades in 1/1,000,000th of a microsecond faster than everyone else. That is the very fastest technology, fastest moving technology that's being developed, and that has nothing to do with necessity. Nobody needs to make all that money for nothing, but people want to. So I think it's more desire that drives this technology, and inquisitorialness, so that's not even a word, but you know what I'm trying to get at.
No, it's really interesting though, because even though I think I agree with the point that you're making, capitalism is quite happy to pose that stuff as necessity, the need to be ahead, the need to win, thinking about the future is about giving you an edge in some kind of big global game where you're trying to crush other people. You must have it all the time as a public figure talking about food. And I've heard you on the receiving end of this be asked about trends. What's happening next year? What's the rah? How much is that trend stuff utterly arbitrary and about just trying to give someone a bit more money?
The trends that people talk about in food and the trends that get people interested in food have nothing to do with the future. They are we going to eat more tacos this year or Korean fried chicken? It's got nothing to do with,
yes, I am.
That. But the food trends that are kind of more interesting are things like Oleogustus. We are generally considered to have 5 basic tastes, and recently people have been talking about adding a 6th, the taste of fattiness, which is quite interesting because we all know that we can taste fat as a texture, but did you know that we can actually taste it as a flavour, or a taste, not a flavour, as a taste as well, similar to saltiness or sweetness or umami. It's actually the taste of rancid butter. And on a physiological or biological level, it's how we would know that meat is going rotten and those kind of things. And that's very, very useful for... Would you create a salt that you could sprinkle on a steak to make it taste like it was aged for 160 days? And things like the food pyramid is now obsolete, or at least has been changed dramatically in the last 5-6 years in pretty much every developed country to
Just keep squeezing more legumes into that.
Yeah.
So here it is on 3 different levels. Just keep eating your legumes.
And really up until 2 or 3 years ago, carbohydrates and starches were the basis of not just a healthy diet, but also the basis of our food culture. Now that that's moved up one level in the food pyramid, or if you live in the US, the slice of the My Plate pie chart has gotten smaller, that has huge ramifications for the future of how people eat. If it wasn't just the basis of health, it was also the basis of cuisine. So what happens if, pasta isn't the basis of Italian food anymore, and Japanese food doesn't have rice or noodles at the base of it? That's probably one of the biggest cultural changes in how people will eat as things move forward. Nobody's throwing out pasta immediately, but as it becomes marginalised, as you move forward further, that's a big change. You can see it happening right now. People that make spaghetti out of squash and rice out of cauliflower, it's disgusting. But it's also interesting to see that we have this form of a carbohydrate-based diet, and people are trying to break out of it, but they don't even know how. It's like, am I going to have a salad or cauliflower rice? Because all I can think about is this old kind of way of, I need to have a starch, but I don't want to have the starch, so I'm going to replace it with cut up bits of cauliflower.
Cory, is that how change always happens? We try and make the new ape the old rather than genuinely break free?
So I was just thinking about whether food trends are predictable or not knowable. I mean, some things about the future are absolutely knowable, right? Like, we know the maximum number of 20-year-olds who will be on Earth in 19 years, right? Because there can't be more than there were children born last year. And so we know some grand facts about demographics, and then we have some ideas about culturally configured relationships to demographics, and so we can see an impending crisis in China, and we have Big Hero 6, whose core message is that Japanese people hate Filipinos so much that they would rather have robots wipe their parents' asses. But at least in one case, we saw food change really dramatically because of technology, and that was gelatin, which changed the nature of salads. And there was this really exuberant period in salad making that was all about turning salad into a solid gelatinous mass as opposed to a kind of inconvenient miscellany of leaves.
That still exists in the middle of the United States.
It does, yeah. Happy Thanksgiving with baby marshmallows. But it fell away, right? And what was left behind was just a small number of it. But it strikes me that when we get a new technology, that one of the things that it does in relation to whatever technology it is succeeding, and succeeding is a bad word because the old technology never goes away. The future composts the past, right? We still have people who use alpenhorns, right, as like a serious instrument, and we still have people who drum on found objects, and we still have Zoroastrians. I mean, everything that was old still exists and is hanging around. But what happens is that all the stuff that was shoehorned into the old box, that was sort of crammed in there because there's nowhere else to put it, bursts free into the new box. So before we had movies, every drama that you wanted to play out either had to fit into a puppet show or onto a stage. And then we had movies, and a bunch of the plays that were more intrinsically movie-like than play-like became movies. And also a bunch of things that could have never happened on the stage became movies. And when TV came along, it turned out that there were a bunch of things that had been stuck in movies that didn't belong there that migrated to TV. And I think that when you get a new technology or a new technological truth or a new insight, that what happens is, there are undoubtedly people who are really good at cooking things that aren't based around carbs, who like stuff that's not based around carbs. I mean, humanity isn't a normal distribution, and so somewhere out there is the sigma of people who don't like carbs. And those people have been trying to figure out how to get someone else to eat dinner with them through, all of modern history since monocropping became a thing. And now is their moment to shine. And a bunch of meals that should have really never been sandwiched around, literally sandwiched around with refined grains, are going to burst free of their grainy oppressors and be what they were meant to be.
Honestly, just over the road, you can buy a hamburger with just a lettuce leaf instead of
animal
the bun.
style.
It's ludicrous. They should be shaped. But your example of entertainment and that shift, you know, what still happens is that the big compliment that's paid to the new era of TV is it's very cinematic, or there's this kind of hankering for the previous standards of excellence, even as those parameters shift and change, I think.
And I was just recalling, when you're looking for signals of weak change in the future, it helps to listen to lots of different things. So I was listening to something on the future of music, and the future of music will be 1980s Billy Joel.
Always, forever.
This is the
We're
second.
living here in Allentown. That's what I'll say to you all.
And there's some theory behind that, and you can see that could possibly be a thing, and there's enough other weak trends around it for you to go, yeah. But to me, that's that perfect example of cycling back, and also maybe not being able to really imagine anything different as well. So when we're looking for signs about what might be different in the future, we grab onto things that we already know to describe them.
Do futurists hate trends forecasters?
Hey, absolutely.
I hear
Yes.
that's going to be a big thing next year.
You heard it here first. Yeah, we get very frustrated because you're constantly asked, you know, what's going to happen? How do you know? And it's one very narrow. It would be about 0.5% of what I would take in to help people think about the future. So, yeah.
But part of that, I mean, you were saying that you are looking for the thing that's an outlier that will catch on in the future. But even if somebody thinks of that thing, who will adopt it, right? Like you're saying, people abhor the thing that they've never heard of. If they don't know where to put it in their mind, how to categorize it, then they just might not use it. You know, it's like getting a new tool. I don't know where this goes, so I'll just not use it at all.
Or they use it in ways that you never really thought they would use it.
Exactly, right.
There are some pretty good tells that something isn't mature yet, and a lot of it has to do with what we call it. If anything called a 3D printer is not yet mature, right? A 3D printer is a 3D printer in the same way a car is a horseless carriage.
Maggie, taking your example of the solar vision of the future, though, there is that thing about changes that feel inevitable, that feel smart, that the reasons for them are absolutely kind of manifest, and we can all see them and see the value of them, and yet they don't eventuate, or they don't eventuate as quickly as we might anticipate. Why is that?
I was going to say, are you going to ask me why that is? I mean, I think it's because some of us get to wake up in the morning and say, what problems do I want to solve today? But a lot of the world has to kind of go about their day just making ends meet, feeding themselves, feeding their kids. And it's much easier to use the tool, like you said, that you already know how to use it. It's more efficient for you fitting into your daily life than to take the time mentally and emotionally to make a different choice, I think. So hopefully we get to keep having the luxury, I guess, of thinking these thoughts, and then the challenge is to make them available to everybody so that they can become the future.
Which is why we get the future we deserve.
Yes, then we deserve it. We will have earned it then.
So what do we deserve? Why do we deserve anything?
Oh.
There's an incredible amount of guilt that goes into the idea of what we deserve. And, everybody in this room lives comparatively an extraordinarily privileged life compared to the rest of the world. And so we have, I guess, in terms of food anyway, we have a food system that, in terms of calories, the world produces more than enough calories to feed everybody on Earth many times over. And yet 3 million children die from malnutrition every year. The way we have designed this system, probably not by choice, but certainly by desire, is one that quite literally takes food from a poor person and puts it not in the mouth of a rich person, but in the rich person's bin. So you could say that we are all terrible people for allowing that to happen, but nobody allowed that to happen. Nobody forced that to happen. It just kind of happened, whether or not by a mission. And the difficulties in being able to forecast something like that happening doesn't mean that we should all beat ourselves up about it and we should feel guilty and we should donate all of our money to the third world and we should not go to university. But this idea of guilt driving what we deserve and whether we're good or bad and allowing the present to turn out how it is and allowing the future to turn out how it could be is a bit ridiculous. We can, I guess, by virtue of our privilege now, exert a lot more change. You know, like Maggie was saying, we are the ones, not the farmer in Senegal. We are the ones that have the ability to think about solving these problems, not him who has to go out and make sure that he and his family are surviving 1 week to the next.
So then, should the question not be what future do we deserve, but given that we're having this conversation in, as you say, a very privileged setting, what future should we take responsibility for?
Or whose future would be my question. So who deserves the future? So there's this term by the futurist Sahel Ayatollah, who's based in Queensland. He talks about colonised futures. You know, he says the future's already colonised. It already exists by people who have power, who are already staking a claim to that future. And if we're going to change the power structures of the future, then we need to start changing those power structures now. And any time that future is designed, it's designed to benefit somebody, which means if somebody is benefiting, perhaps somebody is losing. And so actually questioning who colonises the future, who's winning, who's losing, is the first question that we can start to then expand that discussion around, well, actually, how do we shift that? And how do we actually shift the dynamics so that different people are losing or that different people are getting gains? So I think I think that's a really interesting place, because we have this assumption, I think, that some of those things are already set in place. And, you know, they're not if we can use greater imagination.
It's almost arrogant, I think, to believe that we can control all of that and that we're responsible for what we deserve and what we don't. You know, I don't think we can control what's going to happen. Even with all of our privilege, I don't think we can control what's happening in the future any more than the hypothetical farmer in Senegal.
I've been sitting here trying to think of a way to describe the motion of the way that we behave going through time. And I keep wanting to say that we're evolving in our thinking, or things are evolving, but it's not really. I mean, first of all, that's inaccurate, you know, according to the laws of evolution or whatever, or the theory of evolution. But I think it's fair to say, and you could tell me if you disagree, that at least in terms of human behavior, we're not really evolving into the future. Things are just sort of happening. Like, there's just change, and it could be really bad, it could be really good. Some things will be good, some things will be bad. I've heard some folks in the discussions over the past couple of days saying, well, for me the future would be good, for me it would be worse, depending on, whose future it is. But the reason that there's not necessarily an end game is because it's just kind of happening. Like, it has to, there's no leaping and missing steps. It's one thing has to lead to the next to the next. What do you guys think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's evolution too. I think we have this really misleading picture of evolution that we start as squirrels that want to be humans, and
right, exactly.
we move through a series of slightly, bigger and more erect standing squirrels until we get to monkeys, gorillas, and then humans, right?
Right, exactly.
Evolution's just change, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's just, one thing to the next. But there's a forward motion. The idea of survival of the fittest is that things are benefiting in one direction. One generation from the next is growing towards something, but then what is the something?
Yeah, I mean, the question of like what is good, what is
right.
virtue, is a hard question that people have been asking for a long time. Often it's easier to define what isn't virtue than what is. We can all look around and sense that there are things that are wrong. So there's some good news, right? Like, although there's lots of people living in the kind of least developed nation, $1-a-day style poverty that has always been the primary target of poverty eradication in the world, that number's actually gone down. But more importantly, what $1-a-day least developed nation poverty looks like has changed substantially over the last several decades. Things like hygiene and vaccination have radically changed certain basics about the quality of life at that range, which raises like a super important question, which is that if you could eradicate all of the material want of people who were living in $1-a-day poverty, right? If you could arrive at a place where there was no material want for those people, where you could use networks to deliver high-quality education, where we could use smart technology to deliver high-quality shelter. Vinay Gupta is this guy who works on high-quality refugee technology, talks about recreational refugees, building things like hexayurts out of new materials that can house lots of people in great comfort in both heat and cold, that are made out of materials that gracefully degrade back into the part stream and cost very little, and having, you know, gas phase transition wood stoves where you take a handful of twigs and it'll charge your phone for the day, and all of those other things. If we did that and we still had a radically unequal society where there were some people who, in addition to not having material wants and needs, were also effectively driving the world's agenda, would we have arrived at virtue? And it feels to me like we wouldn't have. It feels to me like there is, absent from the question of material want, there is still a significant moral dimension to inequality of outcome that should be addressed. Not least because one of the things that we see when people who are historically excluded from power and from activities that shape the world are admitted is that groups of people who are historically viewed as incapable of contributing turn out to have been just merely excluded from contributing. And something that may delight you or you might find important, like a cure for cancer or the thing that you devote your life to, might be waiting in the hands and mind of someone who today is in the $1-a-day camp, and who tomorrow might be in the $1-a-day camp free from material want, but still completely walled off from you and from changing the world. And I think that's a really significant futuristic problem that we need to grapple with.
A really pervasive bit of political rhetoric in this country, at least, and even in the past 12, 18 months, is that idea that you justify various economic policies by saying, well, to not do this would be to mortgage our grandchildren's future. That somehow there is a debt, there is a responsibility to future generations. This uttered by politicians who are quite happy to do nothing about climate change, I might add. But this idea that we owe something to future generations. What do you think of that, Kristin?
I think we also owe something to past generations as well. So I'm really taken with an idea of Richard Slaughter, another Queensland futurist, who says, you know, when we think about what is the present, and I ask, I've got students that I take this through. When I ask my students, they go, you know, tomorrow when the assignment's due. Some of them might say the end of the class, you know. But he says when we think about the present, we should be thinking about that present as 200 years. Because then we're standing in the middle of a generational timeline that leads back to our grandparents and forward to our grandchildren. Those are people we know. So we can stand there and we know those people, we know that whole generation timeline. And if we're thinking about that as our present, we make radically different decisions about how we live and what's important. And I think that's a much better idea than just thinking about the future generations. I think you've also got to think about what you're inheriting. You know, because we haven't dealt with Indigenous rights around land here, and so to not bring that forward, I think, is dangerous for the future. I think you've got to bring stuff forward, as you know, from the past as well as doing it. So yeah, I think it's important, but 200 years should be the present that they're working in. I'm not suggesting we have 200 years of prime ministerial elections, because that would be horrifying.
There is a push for longer terms, so I think I love that idea. I think that's a really interesting one, looking back and looking forward. Can I just ask for a show of hands from the audience, how many of you consider yourselves optimists? It's interesting. It's about half. And pessimists? Wow. There's a whole lot of undecided, which is interesting. What about the people on the stage? How do you feel about the future?
So my view is that optimism and pessimism are both foolish errands. In that, you know, I get asked this a lot about the future of the internet and how it relates to the project of human freedom and equality and equity. And if I were pessimistic about the internet and I felt like it would inevitably, barring some major intervention, lead to a future in which the powerful have a longer, more pervasive grip on power, and the powerless have less chance of upending the power structure, I would get out of bed every morning and do everything I could to prevent that future, right? And if I were optimistic and I thought that the internet would usher in an era in which we could work together with less hierarchy and less authority and less coercion than ever before to produce outcomes that were better for everyone, I would get out of bed every morning and do everything I could to make that future. And so I think that the reason optimism and pessimism don't matter is because they don't matter, right? Like, regardless of your theory about how the future is going to be, your course of action should be the same. And the phrase I use to describe it, or the word I use to describe it, is one that's come into great disrepute, but it's hope. And hope is like the necessary but insufficient precondition for making a better future. It's why when your ship sinks in the middle of the sea, you tread water, not because you have any real chance of getting picked up, but because everybody who has ever picked up treaded water until help arrived. And so I think I know about some things that I can do that make the array of the pieces on the board more favorable to the future I want to see. I don't know how I get to checkmate, and I don't know how many moves it's going to take me, and I don't know if I'm going to win. But I do know what a useful next move might be. And so that's, you know, I went back to work for an activist group after 10 years of making up fairy tales to help you pass the long slog from the cradle to the grave, because I think I know about a thing we can do.
But rhetorically, as an activist, aren't despair and fear just as useful as tools as hope?
They're paralyzing. I think fear and despair are quite paralyzing. I don't subscribe to the. There's this thing the Stalinists used to say, sharpening the contradictions. You know, where if things get worse, then the people who should be your allies will see why they should rise up. I mean, it's the ISIS Al-Qaeda theory of radicalization, right? Trick your enemy into oppressing your friends, and then they will realize why you were right all along and join you in battle. I think it's a bankrupt way of approaching this stuff, not least because I think that the people who are motivated by that, we burn out on fear, right? We become adapted to fear. In the same way that, like, if you eat sweets every day, eventually you have to eat things that are even sweeter to get the same flavor, because you become inured to it. And I mean, I think that literally physiologically happens. I think that, like, our adrenaline receptors become saturated and less sensitive over time, and our cortisol receptors do the same thing. I think that, like, that's a characteristic of chronic stress. And so I don't think that's the way that you make change. I think you make change by making people think that there is a chance that it's worth getting out of bed today.
Maggie, as a science communicator, this is something that obviously comes up a lot when it comes to talking about climate change in particular.
Right.
And you know, what it means for a consensus of scientists to say the world's going to warm by this much, or what, you know, the fear is clearly an engine that's used in that debate, but maybe not very successfully. Are you pro-hope?
Yeah. So
I wanted you to take a boldly anti-hope stance, but
Screw hope.
well,
Everybody run. We're doomed.
I'm a science communicator, but I'm also a writer and a comedian. So I've born in pessimism. I wallow. I fall asleep in it at night. But every morning when I wake up, I have to be optimistic, because and maybe optimism is the wrong word. I feel like optimism and hope are similar. Like, if you're treading water and you're hoping that a ship will come and get you, you have to be a little bit optimistic that it's going to happen. Otherwise, you would just it would be a lot easier to just sink. But that's getting very semantic. One thing that I think is interesting about the conversation about climate change is, along with all the statistics about people thinking that it's real or not real, more people think that other people don't think that climate change is real than is actually true. Which is just as telling, I think, about the relationship that we have with each other as, you know, us believing scientists about climate change or not. So I guess the thing that I'm thinking about right in this moment is that it's just as important for us to think about each other and the way that we are communicating with each other as it is to communicate science to this imaginary everyone else.
In answer to your question?
Hope, fear.
Okay, so I'm profoundly pessimistic. I think that comes from just doing lots of research about the threats to the world over the last 10 years. And every time I read stuff, I think we've got, especially around climate, we're doing too little, too late. And not to say, and I think we're setting off a whole lot of things that we, you know, as Adam said earlier, we won't be able to control those. We won't be able to fix them. We'll live in a profoundly different world. But I also don't think that's a very useful place to operate. And so I've learnt to surrender, I guess, to that reality, and to find out, well, what is the thing that draws you forward. And so, yeah, I think it has to be something positive and engaging. On climate change, we don't do that very well. A friend of mine, John O'Brien's just written a book called Visions 2100, where we've all written short stories. So when I say we all, far more important me, like Mary Robinson, previous President of Ireland, have written stories about what 2100 looks like in a positive, engaging way. So we're not saying we need to stop this world from going bad, but we need to move our world to a better place. And if you study hope theory, there are 3 elements to it. One is that positive, engaging image that draws you forward. One is, do you feel like you can make a difference? Do you have the agency to do it? And the third one is pathways. Are there multiple ways for you to get there? Because if there's only one way, that reduces hope. If you've got multiple ways to get there, that increases hope. So I feel very pessimistic, but I'm always looking for what's the positive, engaging thing that draws me forward. Do I feel like I can make a difference here, and how can I get there? And that kind of brings me out of that miasma of depression.
Oh, miasma of depression. That's good. That's only come up about 80 times today. We're glass utterly cracked kind of organisation here. Adam, you, like your co-panellists, talked about the kind of futility of thinking we can have that much impact on the future. So thinking about the kind of future you want, how do you live your life now?
How do I live my life now? You know, I think you have to make your individual decisions of whatever you do day to day, whether it could be using the power of your wallet to change your own buying habits, which then, if done by 1 million people, changes the buying habits of a city, or the buying habits of a country, which then changes the economic structure that maybe brought about some of the inequality that you wanted to address. But I think you kind of have to be optimistic, and when I say optimistic, I'm not trying to go back to the last question, but I guess I try to live my life around the preservation of a society able to continue developing, if you know what I mean. When you talk about whether or not you're optimistic or pessimistic about the future, we've never had it so good. And I don't just mean the middle class first world. I mean the entire world. We live longer, we're healthier, we eat better, we are able to have more children that stay alive for longer than at any other stage of human history. So by every measure, global society is going okay. There are, of course, threats. There have always been threats to that society, but they are generally specific threats, and I'm not saying that to diminish their importance at all. You know, if you were alive in the 60s, you were probably worried about nuclear war. If you were alive in the 40s and 50s, you were worried about physical war, ground war. If you were thinking now, you're probably worried about climate change or a meteor striking the Earth and wiping us out like the dinosaurs. These are specific threats to our society, but because we focus on those, we also have to be aware that the converse to that is that society continues as it is, which is not stays the same, but continues evolving in the same way that it has to get us to this point, where things have gradually, across the board, been getting better and better and better. So if the kind of proposition is we want to maintain our global society in a way that can continue to improve. So I think that kind of implies a great deal of optimism and a great deal of living your life today just in a way that continues to perpetuate the same kind of opportunities and development that we have to now.
Can I say the thing that gives me hope? Just the idea of peak indifference, right? Every crisis that we are in is the combination of the crisis and the indifference to it. And, you know, crises that strike quickly, tsunamis, earthquakes, people are not indifferent to them for very long, right? You might say, oh, I'm sure it's not a very big earthquake, it'll blow over. But once the building starts falling down around your ears, your indifference ends, right, instantaneously. The problem of climate is the distance between the action and the consequence. We will reach peak indifference to climate change, right? It may come before peak carbon. It may come after peak carbon, but there will be a moment of peak indifference, and from then on, only more people will care about climate change. And so, one of the things you can do as you try to stave off climate change getting worse is also prepare for the day when, instead of spending most of your time trying to get people to care about it, you're now trying to figure out what to do with people who do care about it.
Peak indifference is a nice idea. The audacity of meh.
Yeah.
would be the thing. We have about 10 minutes for your questions. Literally dozens of the questions that we got ahead of this weekend were about the future, one way or the other. What will our houses look like in 50 years? What will we be eating in 50 years? What's the future of politics? What's the future of gentrification? You're clearly keen. So keep your questions short, because there are many of you.
And we're going to
alternate
between people who identify as men or non-binary and people who identify as women or non-binary. If the ushers could help us with that, please. Thank you.
I've been to a few sessions today and found myself nourished by the experience of all that panellists such as yourselves have had to bring, and I thank you for it. One of the themes that's emerged, though, has been, as you just described it, the miasma of depression, as people talk about the trials of climate change and so on to come. And so my question is principally to you, our futurist, and I'm wondering, is there much credible research into the future possibilities of what I would regard as sort of a tear in the fabric of the soul that is starting to come with the loss of hope, and how societies might change in the future as people are starting to ask if we are going to have a future or not?
Wow, that's a beautiful question. The thing that's coming to mind is that people don't fear change, they fear loss. And that's not my quote, that's from Nikki Vincent, who runs the Leaders Institute in South Australia. And that has a lot of resonance for me. And so people are motivated in some, in some instances, what causes people to shift and to do something is because they now no longer, they now have more to lose than they have to gain. I mean, more to gain than they have to lose. So it's worth stepping over that threshold, if you like. And I think that tear in the fabric is almost that wrench from I'm holding on to stuff. I'm holding on to this way of life. I'm holding on to the only thing that I know how to do, which is jasmine rice and not cauliflower rice, before I can shift to the new way of thinking about the world. Because the new way of thinking about the world requires a whole new language, right? So I can't say the words I used to say in the old world, because they're not appropriate for the new world. And you sort of see that tension around political correctness, but it's actually around negotiating a new way of behaving together or a new way of thinking. This is so I think there is something in there that is that pull. Again, from Sohail Inayatullah, he said we always bring the weight of the past with us, but if we're going to create a change, from the work that I've done, you've got to drop 30% of that stuff. It's baggage. It's like the baggage you bring into a bad relation, from a bad relationship forward. You've got to put it down. You've got to let go 30% of what you're doing if you're going to create something new. And I think that's the tear. It's hard to let go. And Cory said we don't let go. We accumulate old technologies. They're still there. They're still doing that. We're hoarders at heart. I think we hold histories. We hold on. But we have to let some of that stuff go. We have to start talking differently. We have to start relating differently. We have to start organising ourselves differently, working differently. All of those things are necessary because the way that we have been doing all of that has led to heaps of issues. And I mean, today we've heard about issues around refugees. We've heard about climate. Domestic violence is high on the radar this weekend. Do you really want to keep that stuff? But we worry about putting it down in case, because we don't really know yet. But we have this opportunity to create something new. And I think that is not so much a tear in the heart or a depression thing. I think it's just that innate fear of loss. But it's worth taking the risk. It's worth having a punt if you can see what you might gain, if you can see what's coming, and that's the call for hope. That's the call for optimism.
I've got to say, Kristin, you're the least convincing pessimist I've ever met. A question from a woman or... Excellent.
So we're talking a lot about human survival, and we're getting better and better at extending our lives. So what happens when we start? Is it possible for humans to start living too long and increase overpopulation of the Earth?
Thank you.
I think that our birth rate overall drops so much over time that as our societies become more industrialized, that I'm just not all that worried about it. I think that when we talk about overpopulation, generally speaking, if you unpick it long enough, it's that the wrong people are having too many babies, right? And it's the people who aren't sort of civilized like us. It's those people who are already in resource-deprived environments who are having so many babies. And the reality is that like those two things go together, right? Like if you want to make people have fewer babies, make their environments less resource-deprived, and generally speaking, as soon as women can control their fertility, the birth rate drops really fast. And actually, like the real important question about an aging demographic is how much automation we have and what our redistributive policies look like, and also how vigorous or robust people are into old age, right? Like if people can continue to work into old age, and if there's enough gainful employment for everyone, or a social safety network that doesn't require everyone to work 40 or 60 or 100 hours a week, then it doesn't really matter. Like if you get any one of those things, then it doesn't matter. What matters is a society whose culture is to retire at 65 with the expectation you'll be dead by 70, in which people are routinely living into their 90s, and in which the birth rate, there is no adequate pension system, and in which the birth rate has fallen to below the replacement rate. That's China, right? It's one couple with one child with 4 grandparents. And maybe even 8 great-grandparents to that one child, all of them living on 2 incomes with no state pension system. That's a demographic crisis, right? And the longer the olds live, the worse that demographic crisis gets. But it's not intrinsic to being old, right? It's about the social arrangements around age, work, and mutual aid that make that happen.
Yeah, and we probably need to have a good discussion about death, but I don't want to ruin my optimistic statement of the previous question. But I think that's the other end, because a lot of our medical interventions are really, there's a lot of money and a lot of research that goes into extending lives by actually a pretty small amount, because we're not brave enough to have conversations about death, really, in Western society at least. We don't do that very well. And I've seen in my scanning countless articles talking about that in the last 6 months. So I think it's a discussion that we're starting to get ready to have. But it's hard.
There's a doctor called Atul Gawande who did the Wreath lectures last year on the BBC about this, and he's brilliant. He's an Indian American doctor, and he says that if we were rational and good and smart about this, that when you're young we would trade the quality of your life for its length. So we might take out your gallbladder or do something else that would make your life very unpleasant for a few months, but would make you live much longer. But when you're old, we should be trading the length of your life for its quality. And that it's not that hard to understand the reasoning of that. And when we do it, when it's applied in clinical cases, which they did at Boston University, they did a huge randomized double-blind trial, or not double-blind, but randomized trial. They came out with really spectacularly great outcomes for the people who, at the end of their lives, chose to improve their quality of life rather than its length.
I think we had a question up here.
Hi, I was just wondering, is there one thing that you each can tell me is something that you value personally that you wish would occur in the future, that would like really make you personally happy to see in the future, and it might be something that we can actually work towards as a society, or that you just wish would happen and you don't see it happening right now?
Big question.
That's such a lovely question that we might make that the last one time-wise, so each of the 4 of you get your summing up perfect future statement. Who wants to go first?
One thing you want, not like the perfect world, just one thing you want.
Yeah.
The question is worried you're going to go on too long as well, so...
Look, first of all, I don't think we have the power to bring that into being, no matter what it is. I would like to see a greater distribution in our food system. Just because I'm the food guy here, I should probably say something about that. But it's quite true. You know, the amount of energy that we put into making sure that everybody here can eat a steak at the expense of millions of people who can't even feed themselves day to day is extraordinary and deeply unfair and deeply unnecessary and deeply unhealthy for us and for them. So that is, to me, a glaring problem that, you know, overpopulation aside, is something that's quite wrong. And it's actually, I think, going to change, because to allow that to change, you kind of need to change the structure of the capitalism that prices that steak so high. But thankfully, through no design of anyone, the cost of producing beef and pork and things is rising so much relative to the amount that we're willing to pay for it. Nobody's going to eat a 300-gram steak if a 300-gram steak costs $400, which is probably the direction that it's headed. So we don't actively have to do all that much to bring that about. You know, I'm certainly not a vegetarian, and I certainly enjoy eating meat, but I eat less of it in 2015 than I did in 2013, for example, now that I understand the effects that meat production and intensive farming has on climate change and on the distribution of calories across the world. Oh, I don't need applause for that.
Oh, no, you deserve it. It's
yeah, and it does require learning a new language, because if you've ever tried to go and cook, you know, vegetarian meals after a lifetime of, you know, meat and 3 veg, it's very difficult. I have an answer which is probably full of, you know, ridiculous limitations, but I'm quite taken with the idea that we'd remove all of the nation-state boundaries and that we'd think about ourselves as a planetary system. Not really sure how that would come apart or how long it would take, but and what the consequences would be. But yeah, let's try.
I think I holistically agree with both of what I was going to say, what you both said, in the sense of I want us all to talk to the animals, by which I mean humans being animals, and if we got better at speaking the same language as each other, redistributing all of the power and all of the and the way that might happen would be through just having a little bit more empathy and understanding that when you're talking about yourself, you're also talking about all of these other creatures.
So I want something pretty achievable and narrow, at the risk of sounding modest in my ambition. I spoke about it at great length earlier today, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but there's a law in America called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It was exported to Australia through the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. It's in many other jurisdictions. Pretty much every jurisdiction America trades with, the US Trade Representative has made adopting this law part of the condition of trading with the United States. And one of its elements is a prohibition on breaking digital locks that control access to copyrighted works. And initially this was used to make sure that Australians couldn't buy DVDs from America, but it's now primarily used by vendors to lock the supply chain out of their devices. And so cars, you can't service them without buying a device from the manufacturer, and that device comes with a contract that says you'll only buy parts from the manufacturer, so it lets the manufacturer charge high prices for parts. It is being used in insulin pumps and implanted defibrillators and tractors and seismic dampers for buildings. And one of the consequences of this is that it prohibits disclosing security vulnerabilities in any technology that has these kinds of locks, because if you know about a security vulnerability, a mistake that was made by the programmer when she wrote the code, you can use that to defeat the lock. And what that means is that the security vulnerabilities in the devices that we literally depend on for life and limb, the car that is really a computer that rolls down the road at 100 miles an hour with you trapped inside of it, those vulnerabilities fester. And these devices that we rely on utterly become reservoirs of long-lived digital pathogens that have the power to destroy us in every conceivable nightmarish way. And so the project I've set for myself is over the next 10 years to abolish this American law and its equivalent in every other territory in the world. And I think it's an achievable end. And I think that if we can do that, we will clear the way for computers that do what we ask them to, instead of that are designed to take orders from remote parties, and that will make the world a better place. If you were at the last panel in this room, there was some talk about the trolley problem, the idea that we'll have self-driving cars that will have to decide between killing you by swerving off a bridge or ramming into a trolley load of people, somehow not killing you but killing everyone in the trolley. And implicit in that problem makes me crazy, and implicit in that problem is the idea that you'll have a car that will be designed to kill you with no way for you to override it if it decides that it's time for you to die. This is a bad engineering idea on its face, right? And like, anyone who poses this philosophical problem is not thinking very well. And so I really don't ever want to have a device designed to take orders from remote parties that has the power of life and death over me, because whatever bad things arise from me being able to control that device are much better than the possible negative consequences of letting other people control it.
On that note, and my thing for the future is a hoverboard. I'm going to just to be selfish. Look, on that note, we have to wrap up, unfortunately. I would say, and obviously I would say this, that I believe that the only way we get to any of the futures that we've talked about is as a society to make sure we talk about ideas that are bigger than ourselves and ask questions of the things that we're told and of one another. And one of the great privileges of running a place like the Wheeler Centre and putting on something like Interrobang is to do just that with some truly great thinkers, and they've joined us again today. Please, big round of applause. Cory Doctorow, Maggie Ryan Sandford, Kristin Alford and Adam Liaw.